Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Hi, Skura. Hi, Adheema.
Hi,
Everybody.
Wally.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, morning.
Morning.
Good morning,
Morning,
everybody.
Alithia.
Good,
Hi,
thanks.
Good
Adheema.
Nice
You're
to
not
see
far
you.
from each other, Wally, Alithia, and yourself.
No, she's in
Left
Cape
now.
Town, swimming and sailing.
I'm 6 hours away from Wally.
There
Oh,
you
yeah.
are. Good reach.
At least we're in the same province.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yes, correct. And you can see it's still dark here.
Welcome, Nina.
Yes, hi, Nina.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you, colleagues, for logging in. The breakfast talks are really about a colleague's journey. Most of the time, it's usually a member of the KZN Institute of Architects, but every now and then we will go out because we would love to grow ourselves beyond knowledge drawn from plus minus 400 people within the province. And where we can, we try and do themes. So we've been trying to do academics at this point, and we're still continuing with that. It's Women's Month of August, and so our Vice President kicks off those talks. I'm just going to introduce her, and then at the end, obviously, like we always do, just have interaction. Thank you, Adheema, for agreeing. Adheema is an architect and academic currently based at DUT with a PhD on the horizon. In 2018, she was elected to represent South Africa as a Mandela Washington Fellow and returned with a fire to redefine civic leadership within our profession. Adheema serves on a number of regional, local, and global platforms as an advocate for decolonizing architecture, public culture, and heritage. Adheema, over to you.
Thanks, Gra, and thanks everybody for joining in. Good morning. Nice to see some of my colleagues. Hi, Roz. So I think everyone's familiar. I'm a bit of a frequent audience member at the practice breakfast, and I think the most enjoyable thing for me has been this kind of sense of community and inspiration that it brings to Friday mornings. So when Skura asked if I would be willing to share here, I was, I think, equally terrified and thrilled at the prospect. And I think for those who know me, if we needed another measure for my insanity, I went on and said yes. So I'm just going to share and get started with this. Okay. So I also want to say to everybody that has come before me that if you have ever felt hard done by my commentary and that fire that I have, I must apologize. I think having to put this presentation together was a real deep dig, and my respect for all of you has amplified. Also the time that it takes to get camera ready in the morning. So thank you and my apologies in retrospect. I also want to say that the practice breakfasts have been about reflections, sometimes on architects' journeys that have been my lifetime long or longer, and on projects that are undoubtedly excellent, yet still debated on this platform. And while my contribution this morning includes a bit of both of those things, I think it is at large more about how they have aided me in finding my perspective in architecture for now. It doesn't go unnoticed that my presentation falls within Women's Month. And as much as I challenge the way in which Women's Month has been used as a marketing vehicle for neoliberalism and bougie feminism, I recognize the necessity to discuss it within a space as exclusionary as the architectural profession, given the myriad of injustices to those who identify as women the world over. So, why the title Troublemaking at the Table? I really wanted to cut the verbiage and be honest. I take ownership of the fact that I have often been seen and continue to be seen as a troublemaker for speaking truths at the table of esteemed gentlemen. Each disruption has been with an intention toward equity and belonging. And so I take pride in the title too. I am going to be navigating a journey on building perspective, exploring built projects at the top tier, workspaces, the Institute, research areas, outputs, and sites, all across three larger themes: finding, becoming, and unlearning. So themes vertically down the sorry. I have spoken on other platforms on my identity and upbringing and how those have informed my perspectives. So very quickly, in Finding from 1988, I am a Black, Muslim, racialized as colored young woman with Cape Malay and Indian heritage. I'm a Lat Lamaki, my dad's little girl and my mom's doppelganger. I am the bearer of many firsts, born at the cusp of apartheid and democratic South Africa, to parents who bore the trauma of forced removals, and grandparents who bore the trauma of exile and indentured enslavement. Faith, music, and food are myself. Ask my partner, he'll tell you. I'm the youngest of three siblings of my parents. My late father, Farouk, was the smartest man I knew. He was in standard 6 when his family were forcefully removed from their home in the cosmopolitan neighborhood of South End in then Port Elizabeth, now Gqeberha. And so, like his brothers, went on to trade school where he apprenticed as a carpenter and eventually a builder with the then Cape Builders Guild. He would come to Durban as a young man with the rest of his family seeking opportunity and making a new home in Himalaya Heights in the Warwick Avenue Triangle. It was here that he would meet my mom, Virginia Marshalline Frank, now Pfizer Davis, from Soldiers Way in town, Durban's Grey Street Casbah, who came from practical 1960s and 70s Black rock and roll royalty, given my uncle's bands, the Flames, the Cheyennes, and the Gladiators. Unbeknownst to my parents, both of their firm place-based identities would come to greatly influence me and my career path. Unlike my siblings who schooled during apartheid, my late brother Shahid and my sister Hani, at Charles Hugo, Gandhi Desai, St. Anthony's, and Durban Indian Girls High School, I was able to attend a former Model C school, Gordon Road Girls School, at age 4. Both of my parents worked. My siblings were much older than me, and I was a fast reader, so it was convenient that I went to school early. I spent my days fervently reading and in the music room until my father picked me up for aftercare, i.e. his building sites. It was here that I became enamored by the craft of making, the smell of sawdust, and those giant drawings he always seemed to carry around. At the weekends, we would spend time with family and at my grand's madrasa, strewn across our city's Indian and colored townships. A real cultural immersion for me who grew up in Morningside and wasn't quite aware that my mixed race was a part of these spaces, the absolute bubble of rainbowism in the 90s. Fast forward a few years, and when it came to choosing a career, I chose what I had always known, architecture. And because of this surety, I had spent most of my schooling career awaiting the liberty of doing what I loved, not what others had told me. I don't think much has changed. University was an incredible space of self-realization, and I am deeply grateful for the experience of fundamental figures who remain influential today. Lecturers like Derek van Heerden, Leon Conradi, Derek Wang, and Franco Frescura, and others who each demanded this truth from us. The us continue to hold space as some of my closest friends and respected peers in these architectural streets. It was a space that pushed me to think critically about who I was, what architecture was, and what I was doing there. So much so that for a brief stint, my fear and uncertainty had pushed me right out of the doors to a completely different degree and design venture. I had undertaken study toward a BA through UNISA with comparative religious studies, human rights and social transformation, Islamic studies and languages, and ran my own fashion line. But across a 10-month period in 2011 and 2012, my family had lost my brother, then my dad, and my sister's baby. That kind of earth-shifting reality pushes one to truth, and mine was a need to return to architecture school. During this time, I became involved in student leadership, expanding my references to include small-scale, big-impact work by the likes of Nabil Hamdi, Dalla, Asiya Tafuleni, and Lees and Short architects. I went on to cut my teeth with Arctic 4, Somers sharing the 20-80 ratio that still stays with me. You know, the 20% design time with 80% of the effort, and 80% contract admin time with just as much effort. Although I have learned that if you document the design well enough, you can bring that down to 20. My master's thesis was a culmination of these thoughts brewing, an awareness that architecture, this wondrous thing that had the power to build in ways that divided just as much as they united. Through research engagements with Dung Jahangir and Dalla with my partner Juan Miguel, who you all know, and some overlaps on projects with old friend John O'Bennett, who at the time was at UJ bringing students to Durban to participate and then unlearn, Cornubia was selected as a case study for the specificity of dignity. I must pause and credit my supervisor, Juan Solis, and my silent supervisor, his wife, Professor Rosina Mart, for their tireless support, along with Miguel, Leon, Jono, the late Paul Weigers, and Dung, without whom I would have been an even greater mess. I was crying on the streets in a township. The project was a retrofit of social and physical infrastructure, a systemic response to the gaping provision of services to a disparate community of place established in the north of Durban between Phoenix, Ottawa, Verulam, and separated from Mhlanga by the highway. These are some of the snaps within Cornubia, where we had spent months on these streets and in homes with Dalla, understanding the lived reality of its residents, experimenting on temporal installations like spaza shelters, urban sculptures, mural art, and film screenings in an effort to activate space and build community, all while the news channels were broadcasting service delivery protests, the burning of waste and blockading the streets by the residents to enter the remodeled sugarcane plantation as neighborhood. So my project was designed in conjunction with Miguel's as two separate but codependent systems that would tie the pilot housing settlement to its natural environment and open green space network, giving variation to the landscape. It was a critique on the reality of what did look good on paper for the area, imagining definition to barren spaces with the municipality's various departments and its private partners hitting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock on the delivery of promised social services that should have been there in the first place, like schools, clinics, halls, spaza stores, taxi ranks, sporting facilities, you know, livelihood generators. My obsession with Alvaro Caesar's Quinta Monroy housing settlement and the aqueduct and tartan grid structures were very strong in 2016, evidently, as I provided a water filtration system to the steeply inclined landscape where houses had no gutters and streets insufficient culverts to manage rainwater, a treatment facility, a taxi rank adjacent to the proposed and now built East Coast Architects soccer pitch and spaza strip, and the wetland park. So days after my final presentation, which a number of you were actually on, morning Yashin, and after a recommendation from Leon, I met the Barlin Studio team. Dave, I still remember your key ask to me as we were trying to get to know each other and figure out if I was a good fit for the office with yourself, James, and Linda at the time. So what do you make, you asked, to which I responded, well, I had been my dad's workshop skivvy in my childhood home for all of my childhood. It was his ongoing project. I also make cake and patterns. What this slide doesn't tell you is the incredible value of working in a human environment, which is why I selected the sketch illustrated by Miguel to show you all that the courtyard is almost magical in its offering of balance to an often intense working day. At Barlin Studio, I had the honor of working with Dave, James, Lindia, and later Miguel, collaborating with East Coast architects, Sally Adams Architects, Rob Johnson, Charles Taylor, and MAP Architects briefly before my departure. On projects like City Fleet Springfield and City Fleet Ottawa, which I will give you a dive into later, City Fleet Mobeni, EWS Biolab, Ntwalume School, House Morphew, Northlands Girls High Multi-Purpose Sports Centre, and Park Square. So while City Fleet Ottawa was not my first project with Barlin Studio, it was the one that reached completion first. It has a big sister, City Fleet Springfield, from which much is derived principally and materially. Unfortunately, Springfield suffered a contractor liquidation early on, and as many of you may be familiar with who worked with the eThekwini municipality, it went cold, and when the city endeavored to retender, it took a couple of years to resurface. So we'll return to her later and have a look at Ottawa first. Ottawa serves as the northern depot for eThekwini City Fleet Department, the department that manages all of their vehicles for each of their functionings and ensuring that we have sustainable infrastructure in our city. I'm aware that this is a debatable point at this time. The site was plentiful, but not maximized due to the high flood line of the adjacent river. Yeah. Barlin Studio, as before, streamlined the site and built form by proposing a reordering of function that would speak to three core values: dignity, transparency, and connection. Dignity in the engagement with all workers within the facility in order to design spaces that created a sense of belonging and pride. Transparency in terms of access and visibility for the form, as well as across the tiers of workers within the facility. An administrative and service spine was flanked by the two workshop spaces providing this. Connection through achieving the above for those in the employ of City Fleet, but also through the material selection. The choice of a concrete and masonry building over a typical steel shed was intentional to maximize job creation and scale the building into its existing mixed residential environment. City Fleet Ottawa was my first stab at project architect, with James showing me the ropes before his departure, Dave's trust and inherent mentoring, and a great consultant team and contractor, unlike the thugs at City Fleet Springfield that liquidated. I took on the system and fell right into place, running quite efficiently with my clipboard and project file between contractor and consultant, day after day. Around the same time, an earlier invitation from two other fundamental figures, Ruben Reddy and Karuni Naidu, who I had met during my master's year, had turned into an opportunity to serve. I joined the RedCom team with Rubes as president and went on to be elected as vice president with Skura during Patrick's term. There was so much excitement at this time, events and opportunities to rejuvenate the Institute as a home for architecture, starting with the launch of the Changing Colors Journal, edited by Skura and contributed to by a number of you, and the full house for that first Thursday event. The energy and activity continued, and admittedly, I was in a haze of joy, unaware of the contempt brewing toward me. My working with Barlin Studio at the Panzi Museum courtyard put me in touch with Yusuf Patel of Architects Collaborative, and when asked if I would be interested in researching and publishing on Durban mosques with him, I jumped at the opportunity. Not that the work at Barlin wasn't exciting or keeping me busy enough. It was full steam ahead, juggling, clicking away at CAD and the site boots, hard hats, and contract admin of every Tuesday, Wednesday. But more than that, I was aware that after my master's, I wanted to read, think, and comment on architecture and research. So the Durban Mosques publication overlapped with the visit from British architect Shahid Salim, who was traveling promoting his own publication, The British Mosque, and a coming together seemed a no-brainer. A dear university friend, Tasmi Kwazi, had asked if I would chair a panel discussion on the topic, along with Shahid and activist Anisa Musa, and it was everything I had hoped for. Insightful, joyful, and hard-hitting, tasking the Muslim-built environment community to do better in its provision of equitable space. Anissa and I still await this reality as women. I suppose that I hadn't quite returned to a normal schedule after the many long nights of my master's. And in 2018, Miguel and myself entered the PPC Imaginarium competition. Our submission challenged the material boundaries of concrete as we created a series of paper-thin layers of terrain entitled In Between Landscapes. Our entry went on as the regional winner within the sculpture category and traveled the country in exhibition, putting our concept and paper-thin concrete to the test. Full disclaimer, it did survive. Amidst all of this, Jono had recommended that I apply for the Mandela Washington Fellowship, an offshoot of the US Embassy's Fulbright program that served as an exchange program for early career professionals from sub-Saharan Africa to the United States. And so, in June 2018, I was one of 43 South Africans selected for an intensive cultural immersion, summer graduate school, and work exchange in the United States. I was based in Philadelphia and woke up to a view of skyscrapers, which you see up top left, by Cesar Pelli, Helmut Jahn, to our own, Norman Foster, and Richard Rogers, based in a building refurbished by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown between Drexel University and the University of Pennsylvania. Despite the intense schedule of my civic leadership program, I was trained by Liam Conradi and an avid Pomo fan. So I made time for trips to the Venturi, Scott Brown, and Louis Kahn archive libraries, pilgrimage to the Vanna Venturi House, and weekend bus trips to New York, Le Corbe and Oscar Niemeyer's UN headquarters, and buildings so tall that craning my neck did not suffice. Despite Trump's presidency, the experience was next level, and one that I, nor my waistline, could easily forget. With all of the highs came a staggering low. My dear mom suffered a major stroke in 2019, bringing our lives to a halt as we had to rethink home and everything that we knew of it in order to make the space livable for her. I think of discussions with Iki Naroth here on doing what is necessary because that is what architecture should be. The transition deeply affected us all, and in searching for stability, I found Bikram Yoga, a rigorous practice that, in the words of Dave, became my non-negotiable. It taught me that what doesn't challenge you doesn't change you. And as 2019 progressed, my own struggles at the Institute becoming more evident, the reminder gave me a sensibility to remain grounded in the face of racism, both overt and covert, protected by the foundations of the place itself. I simply went on to sweat it all out. I did promise to return to the big sister, Springfield, and so here she is. And Dave, if I miss anything here, please bring it up in the chat later. Springfield was a project born out of a corridor chat between Dave and Ken Freuser. What was meant to be a small alteration led to a full rethinking of the department's operations in 2013-2014, with everyone from head honcho to workshop mechanic. The site on Electron Road in Springfield Park was underutilized and so far from spatially economic. The principles discussed for Ottawa were realized here, establishing a complex through dignity, transparency, and connection, recognizing the multitude of functions that would need to be housed: security, administration, 5 different workshops, services, stores, wash bays, parkades, brake test, and plant facility. I think in their self-promotion, GBK negated to acknowledge the consultant team, including Barlin Studio, Parsons and Lumsden, DPQS, Young and Sataria, as well as the eThekwini City Architecture Department. But anyway.
But great video nonetheless.
yeah, thanks. So I'm just going to illustrate a few drawings for you all, so you can understand what some of those principles and reordering did in making manifest the project that is Springfield. It truly is and was a mammoth experience for me as taking it on as project architect after James and working closely with Dave on it. And I mentioned those systems and Summers's 2080, all of these things constantly playing in my mind as we move through this project. So City Fleet Springfield is located, Macro would, if you imagine, would be in this top left corner as we make our way down Electron Road with entry into the site. And strategically, the project City Fleet Springfield kind of serves to widen the transition between the street by maximizing opportunities for transparency to connect with the area, but also using architecture to form defensiveness, structure, and function on site. So structurally and materially, the building manifests in the following ways. You would enter site into a circuit, be guided by the function that you would need to use, entering into each of the workshops, which are the larger areas, moving on to have your brakes tested, to get washed, and then parking off if need be before departure. Or in various different iterations, if you would need to come in, park straight away, whether you were being serviced or accessing the administration building, it provided plenty of opportunities to do so. In comparison to what was on site when Dave got there, which you kind of see on the left-hand side of the screen, this kind of expansive kind of overstretching on a single layer across the site that just wasn't working for City Fleet and wasn't creating this language, I think, that Springfield does. I might be biased, doesn't create this language architecturally of engagement and connection between the hard industrial environment in Springfield Park, as well as the adjacent kind of residential environment on the backdrop. And so for those of you who are based in Durban, I think if you drive through, you do get this experience and find that Springfield does do that. It's not just verbiage, I promise. So principally the buildings are along these diagrams illustrating the administration for offices for City Fleet's administrative workers, with a service core that kind of connected this admin block, but also served as a fundamental spine feeding into the workshops that flanked it, which you see down below. The multi-level parking that would allow all of that was sprawled and stretched across the site to be contained into one area to allow for the site to become this functional circuit. And also quite beautifully, I think, through the curvilinear ramps, creative visibility through the functionality and what was happening on the site, as opposed to a hard, solid brick wall. City Fleet Springfield does offer a phase 2, which is halted, sadly, but we hope to be realized. I think the full extent of the project will really maximize the department's offering. And so finally, what you end up with is what you saw in the video. Structurally and materially, much like Ottawa, the concrete frame and masonry building would create a cleverly constructed assemblage of volumes that you see in section here, maximizing natural light and ventilation into each of the varied workshops, optimizing the way in which the department could work as the central depot for their operations, all the while holding true to these principles. The building was masterfully coordinated, a demonstration of a great project team, all of whom I'm so grateful to have been able to learn from. These images taken by Andy Buckland, I think, demonstrate a variation of light in the ordering of the quality and use of spaces. Beautiful junctions of curvilinear geometries. I might be biased. I am biased. Yeah. So when COVID hit, we were all forced indoors, and so too was the National Arts Festival. Given some of my prior engagements across architecture, and thinking, I was asked to participate in a fringe project entitled Preservation, a series of global virtual dinners held by a Cape Town-based artist, Aisha Mukadam, exploring translations and embraces of the term by various individuals. Through the invitation, I sought to preserve my own cultural heritage and the fusion growing in my own home. With Miguel being Cuban, our culinary journeys don't discriminate. And so I presented a twist on a Cubano sandwich that used preserved vegetables, cured meats, and age-old practices to create a simply delicious, albeit halal version of the Cubano. There was intentionality and wanting in the recording of the process itself as a preservation of a cultural practice. And I think in a lot of ways, myself and artist Alice Toish, who I met through the exercise, spoke a lot to this training and design while recording in terms of the layouts, the kind of flat layers, the setting of tables, etc. So there's a lot of design thinking that went into something that was just about looking at a screen and eating together. So it was a lovely, lovely experience. As COVID waned and we returned to work, on Springfield, which you saw, was then in the hands safely of GBK Siyazama, our courtyard community started hosting more regular Friday lunches, simple opportunities for us all to reflect around sushi and bunnies. The courtyarders include Dave Barrow, Juan Miguel Dr. Ruiz, Sally Adams, Owen Pillay, Lindsay Napier, Dick Hethorn, Paul Decker, Stuart McLaughlin, Karen Major, and Ian Barnsley. And they really added something magical and mystical to the courtyard. The introduction.
Adheema,
Yeah.
the courtyard group, if I were to say, is different from the Friday group, right?
Yes, so very different. I mean, we just happened to, I think, I can't quite remember how it started. I think in 2017, 2018, we started having Christmas lunches together and realized how much joy they brought to us. And so it was more a gathering around food, an opportunity to laugh and de-stress and win the Pawpaw Prize, Lindsay. And so the courtyard here are the courtyarders that work in the Panzi Museum courtyard down at 500 Esther Roberts Road. So okay. Barlin Studio, Sally Adams, yeah. And we'd have occasional visitors, but the standards were the Combase Macy's, the Brews, who were Paul and Stuart, and the cook sister, which you will see is me. I think also it gave us a reason on the way out of work for the weekend to look back at the simple but so very rad environment that was created by Paul Mikula with the assistance of Elaine Rosenberg. And so I think you see that in this funky little illustration. And to ensure that all lunches and reflections are done with joy, everything needs a sweet ending. And my love of all things buttery and baked turned into a Thursday evening soiree of baking and the almost meditative decoration of cakes for us to enjoy. I grew up with my mom and my aunt having those, I think it was the Your Cookbook recipe book with a whole lot of themed cakes in the 80s and 90s that we would pick out cakes from for our birthday parties. And so I think cake making and celebrating was a big part of my family growing up. Even though my mother was not a baker, there were some very tragic looking Barbie cakes, but she tried, and so did my sister. And I think that inspired my own cake making, which manifested in some ridiculous chocolateness, hazelnut wonders and olive oil and orange and all sorts of decadence. Now, I said earlier that I disliked school, and I think that it wasn't terrible, it just wasn't the environment for me, being ordered by a ringing bell constantly. So when in 2021, Northlands Girls High, my alma mater, called for the design of a multi-purpose sports center to replace their rundown tennis courts, I was pleased to return to school for the task, knowing confidently that the bells didn't own me anymore. Dave, Miguel, and I engaged Northlands, first developing an understanding of the process with our clients, and then assisting them in understanding what they wanted and what could be achieved. The school ethos spoke to community, honesty, and passion, and through this lens, we surveyed the school complex and surrounds, seeking to provide the school what they had asked for, but also to create something that gave the space identity and opportunity, locating nodes, finding clear paths, and defining existing edges. Together with the trusted consultant team, we prepared an order of magnitude cost and conceptual design for the school. The conceptual design is a simple housing of play between corridors, maximizing existing features and enhancing the quality of peripheral space. A building that is at once and simply a part of the journey through the greater complex. The school awaits fundraising to change gears on the project, and when the time comes, I will be sure to approach our regional resident sports expert, Ruben, to help guide the success of the project for my alma mater. These are just some snaps of what this overarching roof and the space below it would do for the school. So my days continued to be filled with build practice, both on site and paper, and I had spent more time engaging in research. After COVID, I was more determined that a shift into academia and the realization of my PhD were the next steps. This saw me expand my research interests by deconstructing layers of our city's spatial history, exploring known public spaces, and lesser-known monuments to apartheid coloniality, like Greyville, the area technically known as Block 8K, so clearly defined and the path laid out by Len Rosenberg's thesis the year before. A version of this near publication is a co-authored paper with friends and colleagues Greer Valley and Sibonelo Hlanganani Gumede, problematizing the whitewashing of architectural heritage on the Berea. Save Our Berea, Whose Place, Whose Heritage was a co-authored paper and presentation at the In Whose Place Wits History and Architecture Conference held in 2021, also virtually. By the end of that year, my practice had shifted into full-time academia. Although it looked less like the lecture rooms that my old fundamental figures are used to, and more like a black mirror, that I constantly had to beg for evidence of life beyond the screen. While impassioned to bring my perspective on decolonizing architectural education to the fore, this format really had a number on me. I was constantly staring at the screen, asking students if they were there. Can you hear me? Are you live? I'm pretty certain that my colleagues and fellow academics know the feeling. But all the while, I kept reminding myself and introducing into my lectures a kind of mantra and a reminder as to why I was participating in the academic space. And I quote, "The only purpose of education is to make new worlds collectively. This requires the practice of curiosity as a daily habit and the exercise of dignified and purposeful rebelliousness. Other worlds are possible." And I definitely wanted to pass that on to my students, that other worlds could be possible, other ways of exploring architecture could be possible, and that architecture could provide perspective and possibility for a better society. Through my teaching, I expose a layered reality to our history, to our land, and to architecture, demonstrating the hegemonic and canonical as we were trained, and introduce the jazz fundamental of improvisation, masterfully shown by Abdullah Ibrahim, Dollar Brand.
Is it supposed to have a sound? Adheema? Oh, there you go now.
Yeah. So my lectures and project briefs culminated ideas that had been brewing for some time.
Sorry, Adheema. I wonder if you wanted us to have the video with the sound.
Oh, did you miss it? It was just a bit of sorry if you missed that. It was just a bit of a song called Mannenberg by Abdullah Ibrahim.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that,
You are
everyone.
South African if you don't know Mannenberg.
Yeah. Exactly. So this introduction of jazz and improvisation into understanding, I suppose, a decolonial lens on architectural education, all of these words that I think sometimes we shy away from within the profession, as well as these 3 vital lessons from Barlin's studio, started to kind of form the way in which I was engaging with students in my lectures, in my own experiments of developing content and research and sharing that with students, expanding my references and the project briefs within the design studio. Those 3 principles, Dave: take ownership, communicate, and learn when to let go. I so often hear myself repeating these values to my students. A few of them cotton on, and for that I am sufficiently grateful. My research continues in parallel to the many hours lecturing students beyond the prescribed SACAP student to lecturer ratios. And last year began a new journey into soft architectures, spearheaded by Professor Hannah Leroux, Professor Hilde Heinen from KU Leuven in Belgium, and Amina Kaskar. The project will see me exploring the soft architecture of the Musalla, the Muslim prayer mat, and the spatial connections beyond the Cartesian grid. The soft architectures cohort includes, from left to right, myself, Amina, Dr. Pamela Gupta, who's based at the Weiser at Wits, Dr. Kara Stacey, who's a musicologist at NWU, Professor Hannah Leroux, Wits and ETH Zurich, although I'm sure she is not unfamiliar to many of you. Our incredible driver, who was fluent in 7 out of 11 South African languages, incredibly impressive, as we journeyed from Johannesburg, from Wits University, across Limpopo and Mpumalanga to the Wits Rural Retreat, which was a fantastic environment designed by Kate Ochten Architects, award-winning, and rightfully so. Professor Hilde Heinen, who you see next, from KU Leuven, Klabi Shubane from the University of Johannesburg, and Prof. Ian Lowe, who you all know. In January of this year, Miguel and I traveled to Portugal so that I could present my research to date on Greyville, the area technically known as Block 8K, at the International Congress on Colonial and Post-Colonial Landscapes at ISTE at the University of Lisbon. I shared the session with architects doing, thinking, and provoking incredible efforts of justice the world over. From Samia Henny's research on colonial France's nuclear remnants in the sand of the Algerian Sahara Desert, to Alessandro Petti, who won this year's Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale, his decolonial think tanks in Italy and Palestine, Khaldoun Bashara's reflections on a life of practicing heritage and conservation in Palestine, projects that drew from Yugoslavia to the UK to the Portuguese colonies, including Angola and Mozambique, Cuba, and back again, from so many others. I felt completely out of my depth, but also completely a part of a true community of like-minded people. And the cherry on top was the traveling that followed for Miguel and I. From seeing the incredible Oriente Station, monuments across a city that is centuries old, steeped in rich Islamic tradition and history, and of course those pastéis that made me cry with joy. I did tell you that I love butter. In March this year, I got to celebrate a joyful product of my many workings on many different things, yet all architectural, when invited to contribute to a publication entitled 66 Women Who Build a Better Future for South Africa. I share the pages of the book with incredible women, including Londiwe Sokobase, our colleague at City Architecture Department, who had moved me to tears just before the glee that you see in the image at the bottom of the screen. To have shared that evening with Miguel, my sister, and my mom has been a highlight of the year. My research continues and is at present evolving into my PhD proposal, culminating deconstruction of embedded memory in our land, the trauma of forced removals primarily, and the nostalgic cultural practices and novel circular economies that arise across our city. I learn every day beyond the confines of architecture of things most architectural, mostly from literature by the late great Ronnie Govender and Rada Jacobs about the meaning of space and home for Black South Africans, including those racialized as Indian and colored. And I want to read a short poem by Ronnie. Beneath the heaving crowns of mango, flowers bearing promise of a child's summer, the games we played, the friendships we forged, the battles we fought, and the love we made beneath those heaving crowns of mango flowers. I'm not sure where my research, which is based on the map you see below, the aerial photograph of the area technically known as Block AK, apportionment of Greybull that was forcefully removed between the late 60s and 1980s here in Durban, on the periphery of our CBD. So I'm not sure where this goes physically, but in discussions with other researchers and with former residents of the environment, I recognize that that all of this is invaluable to those who have been erased. And so my research explores the remnants and memories beneath the heaving crowns of mango in search for an architectural identity that might assist and inform an architecture and cultural identity for those displaced across our city's townships. And lastly, my owning of the title Troublemaker, I will take it on my own terms, provided it comes with more opportunities for real joy and belonging, like these images indicate. Engaging with this profession and the discipline at large through Saia Kzn as your current VP and co-chairing with Vilo on education and transformation, at Saia National through the Transformation Committee and the RKSA Interim Editorial Board, through the AUA as the South African representative for culture and heritage in the South region, through Asiya Tafuleni as a board member, and through educational institutions. Thank you, Karuni, Ruben, for that first invitation to the table, Skura for holding me to it, and for so many of you for letting me realize joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Adheema. Thank you so much. Well, I don't have many wonderful English words, but I have an English word here for this talk: prolific. Not due to technicality, but heart. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask the culture, your involvement at the AUA, also heritage, that's your space as well. I wanted to find out from yourself, you know, you won't actually get any situation, style, expression of culture, therefore architecture in the world that is not mixed, right? Therefore, how do we look at styles or cultures that came from outside the country? You talk a bit about decoloniality, decolonization. How do we look at what's the right way to merge cultures? What's the right way to see South Africa as a whole, given everything else, without profiling, unduly profiling one culture over another? But how do we overall look at South Africa as an eclectic environment that it is, or a rainbow nation as we call it, but we're considering everything else that has come to it, without us subjecting it to one historically profiled culture as being dominant. Let's say, for example, the English culture that has been dominant, etc. So how do you do that in terms of decoloniality?
Sure. Well, I think, Skura, that maybe comes into the argument first, first this definition of what a decolonial perspective is. And decoloniality, and I had a little image in my slides of a little spiral by some of our international colleagues at the Way Architecture think tank, who were talking about this reality that decolonization and decolonizing architectural education and architecture in terms of its the physical manifestation of it is not an exercise in erasure. In fact, it's completely the opposite of that. I think that globally, coloniality has served to erase, and coloniality, much as you have described, has served to make singular, to homogenize our heritage, and kind of make palatable the ways in which other cultural identities, other heritages, other kind of, I suppose, even aesthetics have been demonstrated. And so if we're talking truly about decolonizing, I always use the kind of demonstration of my hand with students and say, okay, well, if this is the reality that we live in, there are a multitude of layers by each of the fingers. All that decolonization seeks to do is to pull them apart, to understand what each of them are, and then understand all of the little bits that have been made to be invisible between them and how they work together. And so if we really are thinking of decolonizing architecture and architectural identity, I think what we need to do is understand that it is simply seeking to be meaningfully inclusive, because our city especially, and I don't mean to discredit any of the architects who are involved in the projects, you know, but I think we have also seen the ways in which singular identities, singular cultural identities, like the isiZulu cultural identity, right? How easily that can be used as a pastiche for architecture, you know, so, it is architecture of Durban, so let's just like take a zoom ray gun and make a massive beehive domed hut, and suddenly we are responsive to isiZulu culture. But in that process, we kind of lose the nuances of the cultural practice in engaging with the dome, right? In losing the nuances of the hut as a part of the kraal structure, of demonstrating kind of cultural hierarchies, of demonstrating the required respect as you bow down into a low entry into the domed hut. And so I think clearly I've also been rewatching Ushaka Zulu on Netflix, and so Henry Cele's cheekbones are very clear in my head when I talk about this. But I think it's first having that conversation, because if we look even at architecture that we assume to be homogenous, and I talk to this in my history and theory lectures with students on settler colonial residential architecture, which is really what we might have called, you know, Natal residential architecture before, the Berea veranda style home, you know. That when we look at the intricacies of it, the architecture was informed by those who were making it, who were Black laborers, who were indentured enslaved from across East Asia. And so the references also come from all of those former colonies and those spaces that were colonized. And so we find roof tiles and architecture and building technologies that were used from other Black spaces. And I think it's a first, my short answer after all of that, is first about conscientizing, about recognizing that history is not as flat as that, and that there's a necessity for us to engage in this dialogue so that we can broaden our perspectives and definitions, and then just be willing to experiment. I think I would personally caution us against this idea of seeking a national identity for architecture or a purely regional identity for architecture, because I think if architecture is done exceptionally well, it is simply responsive to its context, honest to its context. And I think a lot of our architecture is doing that. We saw that, Squira, in some of the projects in the awards tour a few weeks ago with Wally. And so I think decolonizing is simply being honest and inclusive.
Yeah.
If that answers
Okay.
it.
Thank you. Thank you. Another thing, Adheema, are you leaning more into academia now because you're tired of detailing feelings and tired of doing doshegis? So my question is, how do you balance your, because you are very research orientated, right? Research orientated, writing, inquiry, and all of that. How would you balance that with your architectural education, which generally has to result in a building?
The build project.
Yeah. So how is your involvement academically now? You feel it has to inform your building, or you feel you actually could just be an academic and not so much a practicing architect going forward?
For me personally, Squira, I don't think that the two can really exist in isolation from each other. I think that they both feed into each other. And I think for me, maybe inherently this idea of research and being critical and spending a lot of time thinking about the making of things comes a lot from my experience as a child with my mother and my father. So being on building sites was one obvious marker, right? And so I definitely recognize, I suppose, the experience of the simple beauty of making buildings. I think that there's an incredible beauty to making buildings. But I also think that my father encouraged us to read a lot, and so I always want to know more. And there's an Islamic verse that says, "Seek knowledge from cradle to the grave." And so I think that I kind of fuel the way in which I think and approach research by that, is that you are always able to learn more. But I think those things overlap for me personally. For now, I'm in academia full time, but I think that there are many conversations where Miguel comes home with projects where I can't help but say a couple of things about the way things look and the way things are. And you know, I think I talk a lot about that and the need to kind of make things. We experiment with making architecture in our own home. And so I think that will always be a layer at the back that might work in parallel to the research. The way that I kind of describe it is that the PhD and the research is my medium-term focus, and that I definitely will make a return between the two thereafter. So I hope not to lose sight of architectural practice. I don't think I'm quite tired of architecture and built architecture just yet. I think Dave did a really good number in kind of balancing the scales of what we were exposed to. So I wasn't completely weighed down by door and window and fitting and sandwich schedules. All the while, I can definitely appreciate the making of it. So yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. I thought you were tired of working hard and you just wanted to tell us what to do without doing it.
You don't think academia is working hard?
Well, yeah, you're just killing
Yeah,
people's
look,
dreams there and telling them they can't design. Well, I'm kidding.
it
Thank you
takes
so
a
much,
lot of
Adheema.
effort.
The
Thanks.
floor is open, colleagues. Adheema, Davis, Miguel, if that's your hand, it's recognized.
Thanks, Kura. Adheema, I'm obviously biased, but even if I wasn't, I really love the way that you're able to tell a story. You have a wonderful way of like captivating an audience, and I know the kind of chaos that goes behind, and the last minute, and I don't know how you do it, but you have a really strong way of just delivering clarity to the message. So for me, it's more of a comment to you. Thank you for being an exceptional human being, and yeah, thank you for taking us on this journey. It was a great. I'm actually on the other room, and I wanted to experience it. So thank you.
20 points for you, Miguel. Thank you so much. I really love the comment. Yeah. Karuni, I don't know if you want to speak on your comment there. Karuni, if you're still on.
No, I just placed the comment there for Adheema, but yeah, I think when you my comment is also about being authentic, and I think I've learned from all the discourses around decoloniality. I haven't studied it. I love listening to Adheema. She's got an academic background, so she presents stuff in a very interesting way to us architects. But our work in decoloniality has only just begun. But it's not just work in architecture, it's also how we are able to express ourselves differently. I mean, we live in a culture in a country in South Africa where nationalism is just overwhelming, and we can see the failures of that in everything, everything that's falling apart now. I know, Adheema, I was just a thought crossed my mind, but yeah, we need to see the layers, and I love the way she presents herself and her heritage and where she comes from and who makes up Adheema. She's not just one person, a South African that comes from one sort of line of descent, and neither am I actually. I keep reflecting on myself. But in all of that, Adheema is about practicing authentically, and I really I think your presentation today was very authentic, and I really enjoy it. And perhaps us as architects we need to look at ourselves in the same frame as well, you know. And how does that then impact on the architecture that we create? That's a comment to everybody, including yourselves. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Corinne. Any other comment? Question? Prof. Adebayo?
Yes, I've got something.
I'll go Prof and Muketi, and then I don't know if Jeremy, that was your hand, but I'll go Prof first. Floor is yours, sir. Prof. Adebayo?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for your presentation. My intention is just to listen to see what the young architect and the academia are doing. I'm not here to make any critique or anything, but the one, two things that I observe and the question that you answer about the combination between practice and academia, and you said both are not exclusive, divided from each one of each other. And I think it's a very good question we must put in our mind. I think that's a misconception that we have when we're in academia. People believe, your answer was very correct, that when you're in academia, you don't practice. The learning of architecture is of twofold. You have the formal education, and you have the informal education, and you have the practice. All those are what you're supposed to do as academia, not just reading and tell stories. You also need to practice what you profess. And also during practice, you will see a lot of things. But I must also say, it is not too late. It's a time factor. You are a young lady. As you move along the line, you have your PhD, you have the other opportunity to practice, you will see that everything will come together. Thirdly, the issue about your narrative, I like the way you study, you travel around, where you see other places and other things. That's also the informal learning that consciously, unconsciously, you learn a lot from that. In many cases, you may not be able to read it, because many people used to tell me in the past, Professor, you travel too much. What are you looking all around? Me, I have not stopped learning until we die. That is when it stops. So by going other places and see cultural engaging with those things are very important. And that is what I like. The lasting issue about decolonization is not you alone, because it has become a buzzword. Maybe one day we will want to have a debate about decolonization, because at times have been misinterpreted. We are now not in the state of decolonization. What we are dealing with now is the impact of colonization. So when we say decolonization, as if decolonization is still going on, it's in front of you. No, it is the impact of colonization. And that's why in Google want to say decolonize your mind. Because if all of us, our mind is still in a colonial attitude, we will still perpetuate that. And those are the issue, decolonization. And the president of Africa, generally, if you see all the debate in all the conference, all the thing we went to, where all the president, they are very conscious of decolonization. It's not only in architecture alone, in economic, in social, and all those sort of things. So, but what we are saying is that decolonization is an issue that we need to grapple with, but also we need to decolonize our mind. We are now in 21st century. We've got independence for how many years, and we are still blaming all the time. The question will be, what have we done in post-colonization? So we need to look the trend of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. And that post-colonial is where we are, is where the critique is. So the debate about decolonization is the impact in the present day. And that's one of the things that we need to look at. So I have to stop there. But thank you very much. It was very interesting. I enjoy your teaching, and please keep it on. And I'm happy you are doing a PhD. You make me happy, because that was one of my objectives in the university, that I want to create a learning society in South Africa, and we create many PhD in our profession, which was not there before. So thank you.
Lovely, Prof. Thank you so much. Adheema, I would let you respond to that.
Yeah, just thank you first, but also a colleague of ours in Cape Town and a friend of mine, Sadiq Tofa, Karuni had invited him to the Saia National, the Many Voices webinars, and something that he said really holds true there is that the reality is that coloniality has been the world system for over 500 years, and so to deny its continued presence in our reality would be futile. So I definitely agree with you on that, Prof, is that we need to decolonize our minds, be open to new ways of thinking and approaching the world. And that's the way in which we can move forward. But thank you, I really appreciate your comments.
Thanks, Adheema. Moketi?
Good morning, everyone. I've sort of felt like a guest in the House of Architecture all my life. I've been in architecture for close to 20 years now. My question is, how can we decolonize architecture in a way that diversifies and makes space for marginalized narratives rather than erasing existing structures? I'm saying this because I studied both on the continent and in Europe. And I'm a lifelong student of architecture, and this is one of the questions that I continue to grapple with. Thank you.
You want to go for it, Adheema?
Yeah, Jeepers, Mokesh. I think that first it's really nice to have you here. Pass it. And I was saying the other day that it feels quite wild when we have to say things like, "Oh, we've known each other for 20 years," or something like that. So it's really great that you are here. I think it's a big question, and I think that spaces like this and Scooter, I'm not seeking brownie points here, but I've said this to you personally and not just on this platform, but I think it's spaces like this when we are meaningfully engaging with architecture. And Somers, I recognize that I made a promise to you about creating spaces to talk critically about architecture more in the Institute. I think those kinds of the will to discuss first is necessary, right? And I think Karuni touched on it earlier, Mokat, and I think it's about recognizing that each of us are layered and the way in which we approach discussions from a humanistic perspective. And I'm going to talk about a lot of references now. I think that Yashin Lakan does that as well, is recognizing the need to be human with one another. Dave, that was a fundamental in Barlin that remains with me, about recognizing our humanness and the value that we each bring, and just the will to learn, which, to go back to the courtyard is lunch, I think has been the biggest thing, the biggest value from that is just the fact that we are so multi-generational, multi-everything across the spectra of identity and influence and blah, blah, blah. But we can sit around the table. Maybe it's the delicious food and the cake, but be willing to learn from each other. And that's I think, at least my first departure point. I don't think at this point, Mokat, that I am placed to give a singular answer on it. I think it's something that we can build collectively, and we must hold each other accountable when we make those kinds of promises. But thank you. Thanks for your input.
Jody, I see you. I don't know if Jeremy still wanted to say something. You unmuted yourself.
Yes,
Jeremy and Jody.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You can go through.
Thanks, Adheema. I don't know if this is a question or comment, but I see you as an architect with huge amount of passion and energy, and as an activist. And I just see, in a way, the kind of, I don't know, disappointment that you remain within academia. What the prof mentioned just now about, instead of using the word decolonize, maybe let's think about a post-colonial reality. To use other words in architecture, and inclusive architecture, critical regionalism, responsive architecture. So when you touched on Block AK, and I'm not from Durban, so I'm not familiar with it, but I should imagine a similar scar on the landscape as what happened in District 6, which is where I studied in Cape Town.
Yeah,
You're doing your doctoral thesis, is that right, on Block AK? When are we going to see your response to your so-called realization of a decolonized urbanism? I'm excited at that. I'd like to see, I want to see action. We've been 30 years since democracy. Social housing has been talked about in Durban and other cities. We have seen very little on the ground. Paul Weiger is a very close friend of mine. We discussed at length, debated, got excited about these projects, and have done over the last 20 years. So maybe what I'm asking is, can you not lobby government or knock on the correct doors in the post-apartheid South Africa and actualize what you're doing in academia? Become more of an activist as opposed to staying in the lecture theatre, because I think you have a lot to offer, and you can lobby support in the country. Do something, and I'm not saying that in a critical way.
No, sure. Thanks, Jeremy, first, and yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that there's a necessity to do it, because otherwise just saying it holds no clout, you know. So from an institutional perspective, Skura has made incredible headways, I think, with a multitude of departments in our eThekwini municipality, and I think that there are a number of architects a number of you whom I've mentioned, and so many of you in this audience. And I think that there is a responsibility for us to be activists in our time. And so, yeah, I think maybe my only response, Jem, is challenge accepted. And maybe give me a couple of years, 3 to 5. Let's see how it goes from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Adheema. Thanks, Jeremy. Jody?
Good morning, Adheema. Thank you. Yeah, this is just to commend you. Thank you for always being so beautifully articulate in expressing with such honesty your experience, from which I think some of us, albeit very few in the context of women racialized as colored, can relate. So I think those common stories and your ability to be able to articulate that is particularly appreciated. I think Miguel put it accurately that you have a way of telling a story with such clarity, and I personally appreciate your bravery in being, as you table, a troublemaker. I also have a problem with the fact that we need to
Label ourselves like that.
Label that intent to make change. So that's another conversation. But the fact that you don't shy away from delivering truth in truth, as opposed to an acceptable culture within our profession, or rather a prevailing expectation that such hard-hitting truths should still be delivered in a way that's palatable. So while my personal journey has centered primarily on practice, which so far has been largely positive, the outward references or markers of success in this profession and career doesn't eliminate the inherent feeling of often operating on the periphery. And I think it's important that we understand the journeys of people around us operating in what we would like to see as the same space, which isn't always. So my personal pet peeve is this fact that we still focus so much on a process of unlearning. So I'm not sure that I'm ever brave enough to foray into what I'd call the Kilimanjaro that is academia. But I think people like you are so needed for young minds to change the prevailing narratives. That, that our prevailing culture will not be a process of unlearning, but rather a process of being as architects, of responding as architects in a way that we say, like you were saying, is conscious and honest. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. Your comment comes with a very special weight, because you actually have served in the institute, and very well, in my opinion, handling the purse. So thank you so much for that comment. If there's no other comment, I will go ahead.
I would like to
Let me just give Dave. Okay, Dave.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Adheema.
Okay.
As Miguel says, always the clarity in the presentation is fantastic. I would just like to say to everybody who's listening, I've worked with Adheema. She brought such positive clarity and energy and attitude into Barlin's studio. We worked in a very happy space all together, and I think it was the right attitudes that people brought in. I was very, very, I don't know what the word is, happy to hear that as our work sort of slowed down, Adheema got this opportunity to go to DUT. And I just knew she was the right person. She just had, I knew she was going to change lives more at DUT, you know, allowing students to sort of take ownership of their education, and she would be the right person for that. You're on the right journey. DMAT will change. It's honor and respect you for what you've done, and I'll always be looking out for you. Thank you so much for our brilliant time together and our little times as you become Cook's sister on a Friday afternoon. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much, Adheema.
Thanks, Dave. Scooter, if I can just say one thing,
Yes.
following Jodi's comment, and I think it's something that you put so eloquently, and I mentioned a whole lot of references, and Jodi, Scooter touched on it. The fact that you were at the Institute was a really big thing for me, and I think it was why perhaps someone like Rosina Mart was also really influential, was because as women who are racialized as colored, there aren't as many role models for us. You know, the expectation, and my sister and I have this conversation, and we have these discussions in our family because we're quite cosmopolitan, right? I think in our own kind of mixed heritage, and then the fact that some of us have partners who are Cuban and Polish and all sorts of different traditional Black African and Indian and blah blah blah. You know, we are the United Nations in my family, but I think we have these conversations a lot on expectations and societal considerations that become limitations on the way in which we realize ourselves. And maybe to cotton on and bridge into the comment that you made earlier, Jeremy, is that there are many of us who are activists by nature. Karuni spoke to it earlier as well, who have to out of a way of just existing in space. And I think a lot of that in myself, and Scooter knows as well, a lot of these kind of these attributes and the ways in which we are making space in architecture is a product of knowing that space wasn't necessarily made for us. And so being on the periphery kind of brings in a necessity to rethink the way in which architectural practice takes place. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily have the opportunities that we have been so privileged to have been afforded, to be in this space, to be invited by you, Scooter, to talk in this space. And so I recognized equally that it's easy for me to say challenge accepted, but the realization of that is never going to be easy for myself or for others. But then again, nothing easy was worth having. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on that, Scooter. Thank you. Thank you, Jodi, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Adheema. I recognize quite a lot of senior members of the profession on the log. Thank you everyone for logging in. Adheema, what I want to ask, you know, there's so many of your contemporaries doing their own things. John Bennett, Cameron Finney, who don't necessarily want to be immersed in the institute, because the institute is got a constitution, and even if Saia has done a constitution in recent years, it's still very much based on what Saia was very, very many years ago. And so it's a very rigid institute. And you used, when you describe yourself, you use the word fire. It's very accurate. So rightfully, where's my running partner? Jeremy Steer. Rightfully, he referred to you as an activist. I want to know why you'd feel like you'd rather make a contribution through the institute than doing it your own way, completely your own way.
Well, I mean, I think it's in the title, right? There's the troublemaking at the table. If I was making noise elsewhere, it would be an echo chamber of myself. And so I look to you, I look to Rubes, I look to Karuni, as I think key individuals who have spent their lives in these spaces. Not that you're not a young one, friend, but have spent their lives and their professional lives in these spaces, pushing for them to be what they need to be. The reality, you all know, I think, Spiro, you mentioned it earlier, like some 400 members in the Institute in this region, which is not a true reflection of our profession at large. And so these challenges kind of exist, and there's a necessity to address them. And I think that I have, in many ways, been intentionally disruptive at speaking truth to the fact that it has been exclusionary. I think, Scooter, if I was doing that on the outside, it would serve no purpose. And so doing it at the table is necessary because that's where the true change can actually take place. I think we've been very fortunate, and I think, like you also, when we've had conversations about your experience entering the Institute, from where we started to where we are now, we can see the change and growth. And yes, change is slow because it's written in black and white, but I think that there is also a value, much like I was saying earlier, in being able to read between the words and finding redefinitions that give meaning and purpose. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, Scooter, we started the conversation in roping Cameron in at the awards event the other week.
Want to.
Yeah, but I think we need to push harder in terms of demonstrating. Yeah, in terms of demonstrating though what we are doing. And I think, Scooter, that's maybe something, if we had to be critical about the things that we do, you and I and other people like us in the Institute across the regions in the country, right? We spend a lot of time laboring on at the table and maybe sometimes forget the necessity to like push the chair aside, turn around and address the people beyond us. And so I think that there's a challenge in that for us in being broader, and there's a challenge for the table in not expecting us to carry that load alone. And Karuni, if your hand is up because of that, I think that's really important. We as individuals, just because, friend, we are different to the esteemed gentlemen of the past when the Constitution was deliberated and determined in age old, we simply cannot bear the responsibility of change alone. Yes, we can catalyze it, but I think it would be futile for us to carry it alone. Yeah.
No, lovely. Thank you so much, Adheema. Both the gentlemen I mentioned, including Cameron, are good partners of the Institute, so I'm not taking a jab on them or anything. Karuni?
Yeah, just to just a comment from me. I think you said it earlier. You were talking about Saia. The work that we're doing to attempt to transform an organization that just has not changed from the time it was formed. It's quite a challenge. I think Kumarsan Thamburan used a good term to describe Saia when he said, when he talked about ghosts from the past. It's what holds the Institute back from transforming. The thinking around what is an architect 100 years ago, it's not relevant anymore. It's not that all of it is not relevant. It just doesn't ring true anymore. There's a lot doesn't fit, and you're holding on to something that's not even there. So that's just one comment. The other comment I just wanted to make was around activism. and being seeing activism as things in separate little silos. You're an activist at Saia, but you still think that your councillor is responsible for sorting out the hole on the road, the pothole on the road. How do you bring all of these things together and actually engage with the society you live in, your community around you, your professional institute? It's all the same. And I think one should not be an activist in one space without ignoring the other. We're all very much. I remember when I was a student, and the way that we saw architecture was so different, during the years when apartheid was falling apart. And the role of an architect then, we saw our role then as being very different to where we are now, or the way young people see architecture now, and the role of the profession is completely different. I think Jeremy is right, Adheema. The Block AK thing. We've been talking about that from the 80s, and I think Jeremy's right. We want to see it. What is it? What are the lessons you have? Practical. How do we actually go and address these urban problems that we've been talking about for decades now? But yeah, just from my side, and to Adheema as well, we need holistic people in architecture. Architects must be holistic. They must not be taught to be just an architect in a studio, in a university, a department of architecture, and then in your studio, and then in your home, and then in your gated estate, etc. We belong to a bigger space, and there's change in the. I mean, even Jody sort of expressed something around being equal, us trying to operate in a space where we're not actually equal. Some of us don't have, still in 2023, do not have access to architectural work, for example. It's the same battle we were fighting when we were in the 80s, and we couldn't have access to work. Many of us still don't have access to private sector work, of the scale that some other groups within our profession do. So, there's a lot of things that are not right. Like access to work is just as important as transforming Saia. What is Saia? I mean, I'm lumped with that as a transformation chair at the moment. I don't even know what I'm doing. But I must say, I'd like to just, while I've got the space, to just invite people to interact with our Many Voices webinars, because there's a lot of stuff that's coming out of there. And it's sort of telling us where the areas are that we need to focus attention on in terms of transformation. And it's not just this abstract idea of transformation that's sort of up there and it's going to happen and we're all responsible for it. So in the different interactions that we have as professionals and as people and as human beings, what are the important things now in 2023? I mean, sustainability should be very high on the agenda. Yeah, and are there priorities, or is just everything important now? Should we be holistic people? And that's what I like about your presentation, Adheema. We need to be holistic. We need to not be scared to bake, to cook, to bring all of that into the office. And women need to be accepted for the fact that they don't just come to work and forget about what happens at home and child rearing and all of those other responsibilities that many women have because of society and just because of the way they are. So my lesson would be to just be more like Adheema, be holistic, don't be embarrassed to bake as well as run site meetings and do all of that. We made up of a lot of parts, and we should not neglect any of those parts of ourselves as well, because we need to bring everything to work when we come to work every day. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Karuni. Tebuko?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. I'd like to also add a comment. Thank you, Adheema, for your presentation. Very inspiring. I love your work and the process that you've taken. I just want to add to some of the comments that have come up about the notion of wanting to see this inclusive environment and it being something that we physically see and touch. And I also want to address the notion of letting go, that we also need to address that people have to let go of certain privileges that come with exclusivity. And then if we can address that letting go and how we can also catalyze and speed up the process of also seeing these physical inclusive spaces, because what's holding us captive is also the physical manifestation of separation itself. And it becomes very difficult to implement these physical changes in the landscape if they're being held on by certain powers. So it becomes actually quite difficult to actually see some of the things because it's been held back from society. And we need to talk about letting go and how we can let go as a collective, and also how we can collectively contribute to the process of being inclusive and actually being honest about the challenges that come with inaccessibility, exclusivity, and how it makes cities very unsustainable. If you're going to look at the urban agendas and sustainable development goals, they become quite difficult because they are the foundations of capitalism itself. And how we need to, if we're going to change the language itself, we need to talk about how unsustainable our cities are because they're exclusive. So if we really want to see sustainability and inclusivity, we need to talk about letting go of those privileges so that people like Adheema can be able to do their work as well. Because these institutions are holding on to that power. And we need to address that. That's my point.
That is correct, Ebuhu. And we can only address that as one voice in the profession. Hence, we have these discussions so that we solidify and consolidate our voice as a fraternity, as a profession. Your parting shots, Adheema. We started at 4 minutes late, so we're now over by 3 minutes.
I think just in closing, just to live honestly and to not be afraid to have our eyes open and our hearts open equally. So I think it comes from a principle from my own faith and practice and understanding that the heart is the place of true intellect. And so if we engage with each other on a human, compassionate level, with a will to learn, with a will to see, and a will to listen to each other, I think that there's more value that can come from that than anything else. And just deep gratitude to you for this space, Skura, and for being able to contribute to it, and for everybody who's participated and commented and shared in the chat. Just thank you very much. I carry that with me in my heart as we move forward and make space for more agency. So just thank you, Skura. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Adheema. The Institute is the Institute of Diversity, and we have views from all corners, all sectors of society. And so next talk we are having is going to be one of my mentors for my thesis under Professor Adebayo, straight from Plettenberg Bay, Alita Duncan Brown, returning to us in 2 weeks' time. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Adheema, for bearing your soul like that and sharing your experiences and your aspirations and your fire. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. May you all have a good weekend. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Adheema. You're
Shotgun.
Thank you, everybody.
Vinny,
Very
all
good
quiet
one.
there.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Adheema.
Thank you, Michael.